office of deaconess within the church. The servant of the Lord Most High. She was the helper. She was the encourager. She was the one who influenced by financial means. She graciously did the work of God so that the one in front looks good. The one in front looks like they know what they're doing, even if they don't. The servant. This gives me an opportunity really to speak about the role of women in church, doesn't it? And I sit here and I take this opportunity. You see, during the first few centuries of the church, the role of women servant to care for fellow believers who were sick, for the poor, for strangers that passed through, for those that had been in prison, was a great need. They were also responsible for helping baptize and disciple the new women converts and instruct the children and other women. And as I said, as you look and study at what this little word servant means, it means as a deaconess who commended with the most responsibility the work of God within the church. I grew up in a church that if you were a woman, you were allowed to do one of two things, and maybe not both of them on the same Sunday. You could teach in the younger grade Sunday school classes with the children, and you could cook. Those are the only really two things that you could do, and probably wouldn't be allowed to do both of them on the same day. But in the Bible, and in trying to build a Bible-centered ministry, let me tell you something, ladies. There's a much greater responsibility for you than just serving in the menial task, we might call them. For the work of God is hindered because men stand in your way, and we realize that. As we sit here and we think of what the role of a woman deaconess would be within the church, obviously she would serve the Lord. Obviously she would pray and seek God's will. Obviously she'd be one that would build up on the leaning side, as we've said. But she'd have greater responsibilities as well in making decisions for the direction of the ministry, for leading the ministry to go forward in a community. Isn't it an amazing thing that as you look through the church today, over 50% of the attendees in the church are women, and if we limit their role as something menial or something in the back, pushed into the corner, guys, that we're neglecting what God has already done for us. I talk to you guys just for a minute. You're afraid that they might assert authority over you in some way. But God has commissioned them and talented them and given them special abilities that if they do not serve, they're hindering God's work. And we are the lesser for it. As you look through this list of individuals that the Apostle Paul wrote, I believe I counted at one time that there was 30-something individuals mentioned. Over half of them are women who supported the ministry, who served alongside of the Apostle Paul. And somewhere along the way, we have taken the role of the women deaconesses and we pushed them into the kitchen and into the role of cleaning ladies. And that's to our shame. I need to move forward, and maybe this will give us thought for other Bible studies at later times. But the Apostle Paul in verse number 3 through verse number 16 continues in this outpouring of love and affection for his beloved friends. And he greets him cordially in the Lord. As you sit here and you go through the list, and I said, we just name a few of them. Men like Narcissus and Rufus, and the mother of Rufus, who was a mother of the Apostle Paul. Time doesn't allow us to dig into each individual in detail. And sometimes they're only mentioned just right here in Scripture. But he greets Priscilla and Aquila, a husband and wife team, which is sort of interesting that in almost every case, more times than not, the wife is mentioned first in this list, which is sort of the opposite. They met the Apostle Paul while that they were visiting Corinth. They had fled Rome along with a group of Jews because they were being expelled by the Emperor Claudius. And they met there in the synagogue, and it's interesting that Aquila was a tent maker, and the Apostle Paul was a tent maker. I go back to a friend is someone that you have something in common with. And actually, the Apostle Paul lives there in their home while he's there in Corinth as he serves God and also works a job called a tent maker. It says that they were fellow workers with Paul in whom they had risked their own necks for, probably more than once. Their lives were put in jeopardy for the Apostle Paul. And they protected him. Now obviously, their selfless service to many other Christians as well that aren't mentioned here, but the Paul here thanks God for them and commends them back to the church at Rome. Later on, Aquila and Priscilla moved from Corinth to Ephesus, and there they meet a young man named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, mighty in the Scriptures, it says. It says that he didn't have a full understanding of the gospel, though, because he was only acquainted with the baptism of John. And Priscilla and Aquila heard him, and they took him aside, and they explained to him the way of God more accurately. Acts chapter 18, verse 24 through 26. It's amazing how that these servants of God are used of God to literally shape the lives of the great preacher Apollos. There's a man by the name of Epanetus. You think, well, why would Paul mention him? It's the only place in Scripture his name is mentioned. And right after his name, you know what it says? He was the first convert to Christ in Asia. In a whole continent where the gospel of Jesus Christ went out. You remember the story? The Apostle Paul wanted to go up into Asia, and he heard the Macedonian call, and it literally turns the ministry from the Far East to what we know of as Turkey. To this day, there are strong Bible-believing churches in that country where their culture has been shaped not by Buddhism, or not by Hinduism, or not by this prophet named Muhammad, but by Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God. Through a man probably who started it all, Epanetus. He says, greet this one Mary. It's the easiest name of the entire group. How could you possibly miss this one? Her name is Mary. But the trouble is, we don't know much about which Mary this might be. But we do know that she was a hard worker. And he repeats that over and over again. We sit here and the Apostle Paul ends this section with an admonition to greet one another with a holy kiss. You know, with the day that we live in, it's very difficult to fulfill this particular passage of Scripture. I mean, if you see it in the European culture and the Eastern culture, where guys come up and they kiss one another on the cheek. You see it in other cultures where an individual, when they come back into Israel, they kneel down on the ground and they kiss the ground. If you've ever gone outside of the United States and come back into this country, you understand what it's like to kneel down on the ground and kiss the very ground that's called this great country of ours, the United States. But here it says, greet one another with a holy kiss. There is what I call a positive touch. An individual, and I've got to be honest with you, I grew up with one of these guys that's sort of at arm's length, you know. I don't do this hugging thing very well. But, you know, there is something to be said that when you come together with a group of individuals, there's a positive touch.